do about 10, 15 minutes of kind of explaining your trajectory and kind of how you got to where you got, and then we'll kind of open it up to a few questions, and then of course questions that are kind of pertinent to your coverage, what's going on, and also kind of what tips you have for journalism students. But the very first thing I wanted to do was play Name That Republican.
Oh boy.
Which I found in my office because Alan Schroeder, who just retired, he left this and a bunch of VHS tapes in my office, or I just took over his office. And this is a great game, and it's clearly outdated because the very first one is hard to see, and it's probably hard to see on the video too. But
you can
kind of tell, it's W. Yeah. It's W, you can tell by the kind of hair. But I'm just going to do one, which is, I'll do two.
Okay.
Former governor of Massachusetts, nickname, oh, that's easy, Mitt.
Wait.
We all know that.
Willard Romney.
There you go. I was going to kind of pivot the question. Yes, Willard Romney. Who knew it was Willard? Did not know that. Joe Biden's middle name, anyone?
Robinette.
What is it?
Robinette.
Robinette?
Joseph Robinette Biden III, I believe.
Sure, like knowing like the odd names of presidents.
Isn't my well? I figured that all the politics stuff was already covered, but yes, I've got past presidential election results from the 1800s and middle names of politicians. I'm your man for that as well.
All right, last one,
all right.
And not Massachusetts based.
Okay.
His nickname in high school was Rooster. Former senator of Pennsylvania. Conservative Roman Catholic.
Rick Santorum.
Yes, Rick
Wow.
Santorum. Okay,
Very
so
Rooster
nice, very
Santorum.
good. So I'll leave these here so we can play. But that's great. Yeah, you killed the questions.
Well, thank you.
So clearly you are a political analyst for FiveThirtyEight.
Yes.
Please tell us about your trajectory. Kind of, I know that you've dabbled a lot in baseball, sabermetrics, kind of getting handle data on that.
So I'm surprised that you guys wanted to talk to me today because I did not follow a traditional journalism standpoint or trajectory, and I have a lot more respect for you guys for having gone through it and kind of doing it the right way. But I very much kind of, I fell into it, kind of realized that it was the perfect combination of all my interests. So I guess we're going to start, a very long time ago in high school. So I grew up, in a suburb of Boston, Wayland, and, I have lived here for most of my life. And in high school, I was part of like a club that contributed to the local paper, the Wayland Town Crier, and that was kind of my first exposure to that. So it was like a student, like we had a weekly student column, and we would write, op-eds or analyses or like more straightforward like news reporting around the town, and that was a lot of fun and certainly like kind of piqued my interest in writing. And I typically wrote about politics because that was another interest of mine. And then when I went to college, I decided to major in political science, and I just kind of assumed that, okay, I'm going to go into government or, work in politics, something like that. But while I was taking all of my classes in government, all of my extracurriculars involved writing. So I served on the campus newspaper, of course, and I also worked for a student-run travel guide, Let's Go Travel Guides, which was a lot of fun, and I was a writer and editor there for 4 years. And so, basically by the end of it, I was sick and tired of classes, and I was all about the writing and editing that I was doing, and that was my passion. But then I graduated, and I was like, okay, gonna follow through on the plan. I got a degree in government. That's my credential. I'm gonna go work in government. And this was in 2010. This was also at kind of the height of the Great Recession, so I had a hard time finding a job. So I bounced around via a few different internships, which was actually a very valuable experience because it helped me kind of rule out things that I was and wasn't interested in. It let me try companies of different sizes, from very small offices to very large corporations. It helped me, like I worked in various industries. I did one internship at the Red Sox, which I was like, the opportunity came up, and I was like, what? Like, I'm interested in baseball. Let's just try this random jag. And I discovered that it wasn't a lot of fun. So I went back to doing politics stuff. So the internships I did, I volunteered for a political campaign in the fall of 2010. I did the internship for the Red Sox. I interned for a research firm in D.C., which is going to become important later. And then I interned here on Beacon Hill, for the Office of the Inspector General in the executive branch. So these various experiences, and then I finally got my first paying job, which was for like a political consulting firm also here in Boston. And all these experiences were interesting. I'm glad that I had them in retrospect. It was no fun to be an unpaid intern for a year and a half at first, but it helped me narrow down what I wanted to do. And basically I found that working in government was no fun. Working in like politics and campaigning, which was the job that I had. So basically throughout the 2012 election cycle, I was the office manager for this firm that gave strategic advice to candidates, that like produced TV ads, things like that. And I discovered that like working in politics and the campaigning part of it outside government was also kind of distasteful. Not distasteful, I shouldn't say that. People are doing their best, but it wasn't. It was too subjective for me. I like to look at things analytically and objectively, and kind of being in charge of spin wasn't my jam. So I in 2013 moved to DC and started working. Got a full-time job for the research firm that I mentioned that I had interned for, and this was kind of the first kind of aha moment for me, because it was one step removed from politicking and campaigning, but still kind of in that world. So it basically we would do research reports on states, on demographic trends, whatever clients requested for political actors. So they would use our research for political purposes, but we ourselves were not kind of politicking. And this was the first time that I really started doing like data, and so I would dig into the census or past election results and things like that, and I was like, I really like this, and I'm writing about it. I'm not like going out like myself on a campaign trail or helping or I guess I was indirectly helping candidates, but it wasn't it was just my job to lay it all out there, and then other people could decide what to do with it. And that was a really interesting job. At a year earlier, I had also, because I was bored in my government internship, I had started a blog called Ballot. If you check it out, it's still online. And I started up my Twitter account, and these were also very kind of important things for me. Starting my blog, like I had, like during all the downtime I had, in just sitting around, at the front desk answering people's phone calls, I did a lot of reading about current events and, thinking about analysis, and including FiveThirtyEight. I was an early follower of FiveThirtyEight at the time. This was the 2010 and to 2012 election cycle, and I kind of started to emulate that, and I was like, I have this idea, I'm just going to start a blog and like write it, and like only my mom read it at first. Of course, that was the first few years of it, but it was still good, and I joined Twitter, which was big for me. Twitter rightfully gets a lot of flack, but it was a great tool for me to kind of communicate. It was like a giant, a chat room, with me and political experts and political journalists and things like that. And I, would incessantly tweet my blog posts at people. I was that guy, and I would try to join conversations and things like that. And so that was kind of going on in the background. And then I, in 2013, I got this job in DC that was doing these research reports, which I really liked. And kind of gradually over time, so fast forward to 2015 now, my blog is doing a little bit better. I had gotten, not a ton of followers, but maybe like 2,000 followers on Twitter, and I was kind of a little more comfortable, with my place in the, political blogosphere, I guess, which wasn't a big place certainly, but I felt like I was comfortable. My analyses were getting more sophisticated. I was putting my name out there more often with more success. It was occasionally, like FiveThirtyEight actually in its early days at the New York Times linked to me a couple of times, which was a big thrill for me. And so yeah, so it's 2015. I've done this. I'm in my job in DC, which I really enjoyed, but there was also no real opportunity for advancement there. And then I also had an added personal consideration, which was that my partner was moving back up here to Boston for graduate school. And so I kind of made the decision that I was going to, move up with her and leave my job and do political writing full time. So I was a freelancer for 2.5 years, almost 3 years, And that was very scary, and that, I think, is probably where I can offer the most advice to you guys, if that's a route that any of you are taking, about, the, process of building up contacts with editors and pitching and things like that. And for the first, year, I would say, I, was losing money. But after that, it really did start to take hold, and I developed, a few key relationships with editors and with outlets that I went back to again and again. And, eventually I was able to make, enough money to at least break even, which was great. And so from there, so this was 2015 going into 2016, so I did a lot of freelancing leading up to the 2016 election, of course. And then after the 2016 election, things kind of, all what you're writing about, stops, and then you kind of switch gears, because I think a lot of people, of course, assumed that Hillary Clinton would be president, and now all of a sudden there was the Trump administration to cover. But I got two really good opportunities in early 2017. The first was with Inside Elections, which used to be known as the Rothenberg Political Report. If any of you know about that, it's kind of one of the three major political prognosticators, like the lean Republican, likely Republican, solid Republican people. That's them. So Nathan Gonzalez, who runs Inside Elections, hired me to do a bunch of data work and also to write about it, data collection and stuff like that. So that was great and kind of lent me some legitimacy. And then also in early 2017 was the first time that I connected with FiveThirtyEight. So kind of a topical story for that is that one of the people, so back when FiveThirtyEight was at the New York Times in those early days, I think during the 2012 cycle, it was just Nate Silver and Micah Cohen, who was, at the time, just kind of an assistant at the Times who had been assigned to Nate. And, the two of them were the only two authors or contributors in any way to FiveThirtyEight. And Micah, Nate Silver was at that point a celebrity, but Micah was fairly unknown, and he had 500 followers on Twitter, and so he was the one who I would keep tweeting my blog post links to. And he was the one who would link to me occasionally. And in the wake of the 2016 election, FiveThirtyEight put out a call that said, we're looking to get more voices on our politics page and expand our politics coverage, and we're looking for freelancers. And I was like, I would love to do this. I've been following FiveThirtyEight for 6 years now, and it's exactly the kind of writing that I like to do. Very data focused and objective, and not related on objective as in kind of data objective. Not relying on quotes or sources that may have their own biases. So I replied to this posting, and I was like, you might not remember, but I tweeted at Micah Cohen with these links, and you were kind enough to link to me, and Micah himself responded and was like, of course I remember you. Your blog posts were very interesting. We'd love to have you freelance for the site. So I started freelancing for FiveThirtyEight, and then kind of through 2017, I was basically doing 20 hours a week for Inside Elections, 20 hours a week for FiveThirtyEight. In early 2018, Harry Enton, who you guys may know, was the previous elections analyst, or I think senior political analyst at FiveThirtyEight. He left to go to CNN, which was very sad for FiveThirtyEight, but ended up being great for me because it opened up a position, and they were able to hire me full time. So since the early summer, I've been working full time for FiveThirtyEight, and kind of accidentally, ended up doing journalism for the full time, really, because prior to this, I really had just considered myself just a guy putting things on the internet, kind of haphazardly. But now I guess I am a real journalist with a capital J, which is exciting but also daunting, since I don't, as I said, kind of don't feel as prepared for it as someone who had a formal education in it. So I guess that's where I am.
That brings us to today.
Yeah.
And to this cycle.
Yes.
But before jumping to that, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions about how you cover those kinds of stories, I want to emphasize the fact that you're working full-time jobs and doing internships and starting things on the side. Mm-hmm. Obviously really important to be a thorn in someone's side like Micah's, always kind of reminding people, because they don't know to look for you, because they can't see you, because as you said, I love Twitter as a chat room, right? Twitter and Trump's the loudest gorilla in the room. So how do you kind of set yourself apart from the others? You write interesting posts that you said only got more sophisticated over time. So tell us a little bit more about kind of taking that leap.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that, the first thing is to just, read a ton. That's how my analyses got more sophisticated, is I would write, something, about, I don't know, an election in Colorado, and then, I would read somebody else who wrote about it better, and I would say, oh, I should have, factored in, demographics or whatever it was, and then I would know to do that the next time. Also, I mean, yeah, just putting your work out there for criticism is important. I mean, Twitter can be a terrible place, but people will often have genuinely good suggestions to improve it, or they'll point out errors, and I'll be like, oh, you're right. And that was a benefit for me of kind of, working on my blog, where, no one, would expect that to be a credible source. At least I would hope not. So if I made a mistake, it wasn't the end of the world. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, I think just identifying writers that you really like and admire and emulate. So for me, there are two, I think. So Nate Silver is obviously one of them. I have probably read everything that he's put out since he started 538, and a lot of his ways of thinking and his methods have been things that I've used. And then another one is in the baseball world. If any of you are baseball fans, Craig Calcaterra of NBC Sports is just a really, I love his writing style. I love how he kind of cuts through a lot of traditional analysis and questions it. And he's just a really funny and engaging writer, and he's also very engaged on social media as well. And he's kind of how I he's, I guess, my social media template. Yeah, and so just picking the people that you are that you emulate, or whose circles you want to be in, I guess. There's election Twitter is very much my home base on Twitter. So you have the people Nate Cohn at the New York Times, but also kind of some of these lower level people, the folks at Daily Kos or Red Racing Horses, which are kind of election blogs on the left and the right, respectively. A lot of political mappers like J. Miles Coleman, if these names ring any bells, but building up that network, and kind of once you become a trusted voice within these circles, that maybe a higher force Jonathan Martin or Maggie Haberman from the New York Times goes to for their election when they need to look beyond kind of the superficial level for election stuff. That's I think that was valuable to kind of increasing my credibility, I guess.
So I want to also highlight, you talk a lot about kind of a quantitative approach and an objective, and you tried to couch that term. What about these, the data-driven stories and this kind of emphasis now on data visualization and data journalism, what advice do you have about approaching stories in that way? Sources you go, obviously this is a kind of data-rich field, much like covering baseball. Yeah,
right, exactly. I mean, there's it's no coincidence why those are kind of my two main interests. Yeah, I mean, I would say that, so I was when I worked on my, student newspaper, I did not like kind of the traditional journalism, interviewing sources and things like that, both because, I prefer to stare at spreadsheets in the comfort of my own home, and also because I'm what makes this person an expert, right? So I do most of my writing, and again, this is why I am still weirded out that it's considered journalism, is just using data that's online, and I don't talk to people generally. When I do talk to people, I like to talk to people who are clearly kind of whose expertise is clear. So political scientists. So 538 is very plugged into the political science world, because these are people who use the scientific method, which is of course something very similar to what we do, in terms of getting at an objective, data-driven truth, to answer questions about politics. And they have done studies and run regressions, and these are falsifiable conclusions that they arrive at, as opposed to the kind of conventional wisdom of politicians or of pundits, political pundits, and in particular, I think people who are, operatives on one side, because they're I really believe that you can't trust, or anything they say, you're gonna have to kind of check it anyway. So why did you talk to them? I think a lot of people will talk to, this is not an ironclad rule, and I, have I have friends who are political operatives, but, sometimes they'll tell you, okay, like if you are writing a story about the, the House races in 2020, you want to go talk to the DCCC and the NRCC, the two party committees. But my perspective is, you go and talk to them, they're just going to tell you, what they want to get out there, which is, oh, we're recruiting tons of great candidates, and the map is looking really good for us, or something like that. And there are objective ways to get at these questions. So political scientists, I think, are better because, in theory at least, they don't have those biases, and they have studies that we can point to that are more reliable. And then the other kind of source that I would go to is people who are actually involved. So we're writing about, I've written a couple stories on this voter fraud case in North Carolina, and that's a kind of a story that is hard to kind of grok. So there are all these legal, there's maybe there's going to be a new election, but the law is kind of vague. So how do you go about it? So I talked to a guy who had been the general counsel in the legislature for 30 years, and so this is a guy whose career is interpreting and studying North Carolina statutes. So he is somebody who could speak to that better than I could as a non-legally trained person who who is just reading the law. But generally, yeah, my best friends are Secretary of State websites where there's election data, the census, FEC data, fundraising, polls, of course. One thing I would highly recommend to you guys is to take classes in statistics if this data journalism is something that interests you. I never took a statistics class, and I still find it shocking that FiveThirtyEight hired me. So you should definitely take a statistics class because it will greatly, I've kind of figured out what a regression is through kind of reading and osmosis, but I've never been formally taught it, and I regret that pretty much every day. And other things as well, if there are if you're interested obviously in writing about politics, you should take classes in the poli-sci department, and ones that are more pay attention to the studies that they read you. My kind of issue in college was that the assigned reading would be, here's a 50-page study about why knocking on doors is a good way to get people to vote for you. And I'm I knew that already. I don't need a 50-page study to tell me so. But that is the most objective way, to prove that that's true, but also a lot of the studies, and hopefully if you have, you could take kind of a less, or a more sophisticated class, that you can read studies that actually maybe go against conventional wisdom or things like that, or give you a better cross-section of the different options. If you're interested in economics, I also recommend doing economics classes. For the data visualizations, which we have a great team of data visualizations, but taking computer science classes, I'm kind of the last generation where I didn't take any computer science classes, but I feel now college students, it's practically a requirement, so maybe that's not relevant to you guys, but I never took computer science, and that's also something that would be useful for me in interacting with and giving suggestions to the data visualization team.
So I'll open up the questions pretty soon, but I wanted to ask about this data being your guiding light. I think this John McPhee quote that a good lead is like a flashlight that shines down. Mm-hmm. I think that in your way, obviously leads are important. Grabbing the reader is very important.
Right, of course.
But for your approach to stories, having that touchstone as this data set that you're looking at, or a merging of several kind of polls and other studies together. Tell us maybe a soup to nuts kind of story about maybe a recent piece, or you don't have to get super detailed.
No, that's a good question. Do you mind if I look up some pieces
Sure.
I've written recently? Yeah, it usually starts with, a pattern I've noticed. Pattern recognition is a very important skill. I think I've always kind of been naturally good at that, so that's helped me even though I don't have a formal statistics background. But let's see. Oh, that's a good one probably. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, it's not necessarily having a data set that you're going to want to go narrower. I think I would say sometimes, but not usually, the stories will start with, here's a data set, I'll play around with it, and then I find something within it. It's usually more that I see the pattern first in an existing data set, something I'm already familiar with. There's not there's going to be a new data set that is just dropped in my lap, and then it will usually take me time to suss something out from that. But the story I wrote last week, I think, was about Elizabeth Warren and her potential path to the 2020 nomination by looking at 2018, her 2018 U.S. Senate results here in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts politics is obviously something I've been following for a long time, having worked it and having grown up here before. People obviously don't usually pay attention to election results here in Massachusetts because it usually is very Democratic leaning. But something that I've long told people is that there are a lot of kind of divisions in the state. There's a good amount of diversity. There's urban areas that are, we have several, contrary to popular belief, several majority minority communities. We have kind of the wealthy suburbs that brought Democrats to nationwide victory. We have places in like Western Mass that are very much like Vermont and hippie Bernie people, and then you have Central Massachusetts, which is a lot like or like the Merrimack Valley or something, which is a lot like the Midwest in terms of being post-industrial and stuff like that. So there's a lot of kind of diversity in political viewpoints in Massachusetts, and that's something I've long been interested in. So after the 2018 election, I figured we could take a look at maybe where Warren under and overperformed to see maybe what her kind of natural constituency is. And so I knew that the data existed out there for a fairly easy analysis. So I looked at the 2018 election results, Warren versus Jeff Deal, her Republican opponent. And then because what's great about Massachusetts and other New England places is that the elections are administered on the city and town level rather than the county level. So we have 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, and I also looked at the 255 precincts in Boston. So it allowed for a very granular analysis. And I was able to pull demographic statistics from the census for all the cities and towns, and then also for the precincts, and basically just put it all in a spreadsheet, outlaid it, created some scatter plots, looked at trends, sorted by different categories to see, okay, I think there are something like 20 odd majority Latino precincts in Boston. How did they vote for Warren? And this was a good process too, because the question is okay, so you have all this data, but how do you how do you measure Warren's over and underperformance? You can't just look at kind of raw numbers, because everybody knows that Democrats are going to do well in urban areas, and they do well in Western Massachusetts because that area is so liberal, and those are kind of absolutes. But you this is a good example of something that I've kind of learned over the years of watching other people, like Nate, do this kind of analysis first, is to compare things relatively. So you could compare Warren's performance to some sort of Democratic baseline of, past, Democratic performance. And we had a lot of options, and I think there still are a few trade-offs. And this is another example of, I published an article, and other people were like, why didn't you use X? And I was like, well, there's a good case for using X, honestly. I decided to use Y for different reasons, but, maybe, I should also do the analysis with X. I don't think 538 would want to publish two versions of the same story, but, it might also, illuminate different things. But basically what I ended up deciding to do was to compare Warren's vote share to Hillary Clinton's vote share in 2016 on basically the thought. First of all, they ran very closely statewide. They both got about 24% of the vote. I think they were within a percentage point of each other. So it made kind of a nice baseline, so that negative numbers were truly negative and positive numbers were truly positive. And then also, if Warren succeeds and wins the nomination, she will also be running against Donald Trump, and so that will be a very relevant kind of comparison in the general election, whether she can run ahead of or behind Hillary Clinton. So I basically compared, I said, okay, Elizabeth Warren might have gotten 30% of the vote in this rural town. So that it seems like she was bad there, but Hillary Clinton got 20% of the vote there. So actually, this was a good town for Warren. She overperformed by 10 points. So I calculated that overperformance for every city and town and for every precinct, and kind of ran those regressions with the demographic information, and came out with some findings which kind of squared with my intuitive sense for who Elizabeth Warren is, which is always nice when that kind of dovetails, which are a few things. So first of all, that Elizabeth Warren underperformed in elite suburbs, so places like Weston and Wellesley, which have some of the highest median incomes and the highest education levels in the state. So this is unsurprising probably because Elizabeth Warren's kind of made herself out to be the anti-big business candidate, break up the banks and stuff like that. So it makes sense that kind of the Democrats who are maybe socially liberal but fiscally conservative wouldn't go for that as many as 15, 16 points in some of these towns. And these are the towns that went like 70% for Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary in 2016. These are towns that are less college educated and less wealthy than the state as a whole. A lot of them are, kind of these former industrial areas, so it also kind of squares with the common perception of, the like white working class area. Oh, and most importantly, these are places that moved, like strongly responded to Donald Trump, that were, voted for Obama, but then a lot of those voters moved to Trump. So, my takeaway there was that not only would Warren probably be strong in a lot of the areas that Bernie Sanders was strong in the 2016 primary, but she could also be the right candidate to win back kind of these populist, Obama-Trump voters in places like Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin. A couple other findings were that the younger a town is, the better it tended to do for Elizabeth Warren. So like college towns did very well for her, as well as precincts in Alston and Brighton, and actually one precinct in Mission Hill, which I suspect is because of you guys. And then also the majority-minority precincts in towns tended to be kind of average for her. So I interpreted that as maybe a good sign because one of the reasons Bernie Sanders didn't win the nomination in 2016 was that he did particularly poorly with non-white voters, and Warren at least isn't bombing with those voters. She doesn't seem to have any special knack for winning them, but she's kind of, she ran about even with Clinton among them, so she's at kind of a normal baseline. But she also, of course, doesn't have, as I said, a knack for winning them, although the possible exception might be Latino voters. She did pretty well in, like, East Boston, which is a fairly Latino area of the city, but it was a little bit, soft. There wasn't a lot of a very strong signal the way they were for the other things. So those were the takeaways that I got from the data. I then talked to my visualization team about the best ways to depict them that would be, not as confusing as the description I probably just gave. And we did it, and we came out with what I thought was a pretty good article.
Perfect. I'm glad you chose a Massachusetts example. So I think to leave time for enough questions, let's open it up. I got more. All right, Josh.
Obviously, after nothing else, I think there's a massive public outcry against data. And then, like, Ames in particular kind of has to say, go on and say, like, no, like, just because this is what you want to do to happen.
Right.
Have you seen in the time since that, like, the attitude shift? Or I know there's people who still distrust it, obviously, and that's why they're talking. Audience, whether it is for sports coverage or it's politics coverage. I don't know. Have you seen that attitude shift at all?
No, I think generally people are going to use data when it confirms their pre-existing biases and ignore data, or say the data, data's failed us before when it doesn't, or when it runs contrary to their pre-existing biases. I think that the 2018 election was a very good year for polls and data. Like the polls, in particular, the New York Times live polling experiment was very accurate, and basically Democrats, our model, not to toot our model because it's based on other polling data, so really it's just a reflection of how accurate that was. But our model, I think, called the number of Democratic House gains within one. It was a little less accurate in the Senate because I think a lot of those states ended up just being too red, and we were over accounting for incumbent advantage, which ended up being very small. That's another article that I wrote late last year. But yeah, within the House, it was, the data absolutely nailed it, and I think that people who are, at least kind of plugged into, that world, the polling world, and, to a lesser extent, the political journalism world, depending on how kind of data, philiac you are, people noticed that, and so maybe there's a bit of a boost. But I also think that people probably rightfully realize that there's only so much that data can tell us about the Democratic primary, because it's at this stage, at least until people are voting. The polls aren't going to be reliable until maybe a month out. So like, right, we've got this year-long period where it's all speculation about the invisible primary and people hiring, the right operatives and, fundraising and stuff like that, which is just very squishy. So it's a very dangerous time for data journalism. So, but I think people like realize that it's like all going to be punditry at this point, which is just unfortunate, but we just have to wait it out. But yeah, I think come the general election in 2020, I think it'll be helpful that people recognize that. One thing I do think happened in 2018 is that, like, when we said there was, say, a 70% chance that Democrats would win the House, people recognized that there was a 30% chance that Republicans would win the House, because they remembered 2016. But of course, that doesn't mean that the data was going to be wrong. To back up for people who aren't familiar with it, so in 2016, of course, everybody predicted Hillary Clinton was going to win. The FiveThirtyEight model, I think, had her at like a 67% chance on election day. Other models were significantly more bullish for her. They were like 95, 99%. And of course, Donald Trump ended up winning, so a lot of people were like, well, the polls misled us. And so the issue with that is that, while I would agree that the models that had 99% Hillary Clinton were wrong, the issue is that our model is probabilistic, and if it's correctly calibrated, 1 out of 3 times, it's going to turn out that Donald Trump wins, and we just happen to be living in one of those universes. I would also point out that the polls themselves were not particularly bad in 2016. In certain key states they were, like Wisconsin and Michigan, but overall, nationally, the polling average was something like Hillary Clinton +3, and she ended up winning the national popular vote by +2. So in many ways, 2016 did not represent a major departure from past polling averages, which historically have been within, 3 points or so.
What you're saying is there's 2 parallel universes where Hillary is president. And
Right,
we're
exactly.
just in this
Yes,
one.
right. There are 3 universes,
3
2
universes.
Hillary universes, 1 Trump universe.
Probability.
How do you feel about your individual house race model?
Oh.
Because I know you guys went into like gradually like you could have a odds in every single race, and I think some of those produced larger upsets. Do you think that you need to be more careful in setting individual race odds, or do you think because are you happy with the overall number that individual race odds are like?
Right.
California 21 would be what I particularly.
Right. California 21, Oklahoma 5, New York 11. These were races that we got wrong. But no, I mean, it'll sound silly to say, but I think it was exactly what we wanted, because again, like a well-calibrated model, if you have 30 likely Republican seats, and I think our interpretation of likely Republican was an 80% chance. Let's say, for simplicity's sake, let's say that there are 100 likely Republican seats. Our interpretation of likely Republican is that there's like an 80% chance that a Republican will win, so that if our model is correct, Democrats will win 20% of those seats, will win 20 of the 100 seats. And that's kind of what happened. Generally, our model was very well calibrated. We would expect that a couple of those likely Republican forecasted seats would end up falling in that small 20% category, and that's exactly what happened. So, I mean, yes, like if you were to look at just the one race in isolation and say, okay, there's an 80% chance that TJ Cox wins that race, you would have been misled, and I apologize for that. But overall, I think it's exactly what should have happened in a well-calibrated model.
I'm pretty interested in like the outlets right now that do a lot of this election forecasting modeling. When Trump wins in 2016 and really went counter to what a lot of the outlets were predicting, do you guys then have to go back and sort of add in a new part to your formulas that then account for these non-traditional candidates?
That's a great question. I am not involved in actually building the model. That's all Nate. So I can't speak to that exactly, but I do know that we didn't go about it any differently. There's no like special variable for celebrity candidates or whatever it is. I think, again, like it was, like a model will, come up the wrong, quote unquote, wrong way every so often. And as always, the 2018 model was built using previous results. So like the House model, for example, we studied previous House results, and just basically you look at every variable that you could possibly imagine, from fundraising to incumbency to scandals to various things, and look at how they have affected election results in the past, and then you plug that into the equation. And so no, so basically the short answer is that the 2016 election, specifically Trump, did not change the way that the 2018 models were built, and I suspect will not change the way the 2020 models are built. The primary, I think, maybe is a different story, because I think there is, genuine, there's a skittishness about, I think 538 did a lot worse with the primary prediction in 2016 than the general prediction, because, for a long time, and we've, Nate and Harry, who was the political analyst at the time, have said this for a long time, is that they were very, slow to pick up on the fact that Trump was going to win, and that just reflected kind of this, deep belief in the party deciding, and that people would kind of go to a more experienced hand in the end, but that of course never happened. So I think we recognize that predicting a primary is going to be difficult, and so we're taking lessons from that. So we're trying, one of the things that we are trying to do is to, you might have heard Nate say this on the podcast, is to hold multiple kind of hypotheses for how a nomination would unfold at one time. So instead of being well, the party decides, so Donald Trump's not going to win, or the party decides, so Joe Biden is going to win, you say, okay, there are lots of different, theories about how primaries work, and according to one of them, Joe Biden wins, but according to another one, Kamala Harris wins, and according to another one, Bernie Sanders wins because he was the next in line or whatever, and kind of being aware that a lot of paths are open at once in kind of our coverage, and not assuming anything is a big lesson that we've learned. But in terms of building the quantitative models, no, I think it's the same approach as always, which is just looking at what has predicted past election results the best, and weighting them appropriately.
I have a quick question
Yeah.
on the evolution of political journalism and where you think it should go.
That's it? That's your question?
Yeah, that's it. I want the answer.
Yeah, I want it too. I think that the data is the best place to go. Like I said, I think that relying less on quote unquote expert opinions whose expertise is either biased or suspect is good. There's obviously a place for both traditional reporting and data journalism, and I think we do it well at 538. Like other people, I tend not to do traditional journalism, but people like Perry Bacon and Claire Malone do an excellent job of it for us, and I think that is the best thing to do, is to kind of look at what scientifically has held true in the past, and and then supplement that maybe with interviews and what people think about it, or what people's on the ground experience is. So instead of everybody after the 2016 election going to diners in rural Ohio to ask people about their experience voting for Trump, it's maybe you look at the data first, and then figure out who exactly was the most important voter, and so everybody's voice could be heard. It's tricky, and the big questions about eroding trust in the media, and the lack of profitability, I unfortunately don't have answers for that.
So this is a somewhat far field question, but I read your site all the time, so I read it over the course.
Oh, thank you.
But I'm struck by the fact that the site sort of mirrors, on the one hand, politics, and then the other thing you cover is sport, right? So that there's a implicit message of the site that these are contests in which this is my side, this is your side. And the more time we spend as journalists communicating to the world that what's important is predicting the way that Democrats is going to vote, or that the more we recreate the sort of tribal feeling that this is my side, this is your side, the Yankees and the Red Sox. And so it's getting harder and harder for the hard. It's saying, well, wait a minute here, I like this side on these issues, but I like this side on these issues. And so now what do I do and how do I deal with that?
Yeah.
Where we're not feeling all caught up in the
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. I think that, I don't think that we treat politics like sports. I think that people can, if people kind of choose to view it that way, that's kind of up to them. Like, not to, I don't know. I think your point about, like, the predictions is fair, and we, I think what 538 does is predictions, and I think there is a clear need elsewhere. The great thing about the media landscape is that it's so big, and that we have kind of our the company that owns us is ABC News, and they do a great job with kind of more traditional reporting and issue-based reporting. That's another good thing for a resolution for political journalism, and obviously there should be more issue-based reporting. But I do think there is a place for horse race coverage as well, because I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. So I think that 538's role is prediction, but that it a lot of other places should focus on things that are more about the issues, and maybe deconstructing the fact that it's not actually us versus them, and that there is nuance there, but that people can ultimately choose which type of media to consume, and hopefully they do it in the correct proportions, or hopefully they do both, and kind of make nuanced decisions, but I do think that what like the 538, the prediction is still a valid kind of road to pursue.
We have time for one more. John?
Yeah.
Who do you guys consider to be your peers? I asked this because you've been writing about exponential film, and just kind of curious. You guys sit down at an editorial meeting. I don't want you to talk out of school, but who are the peers out there that you perceive in the world?
I mean, you mean just like other like journalists that we respect, or like who we view as?
Not even just respect, but like you're aware of them because they're in the same business, like
Right.
Data.
Yeah. Well, I think a great example is the Upshot at the New York Times. Nate Cohn and his folks, they do a great job with both visualizations and with data-driven analysis. Somebody like Philip Bump at the Washington Post is somebody who I read a lot. He's really great. He's David Montgomery is another guy. He works for City Lab, so he's a little bit like less under the radar, but I really find he and I think in similar ways. So all of his analyses he does a lot of work on like urban, rural, suburban splits and stuff like that, and that's been very helpful as well. Other folks. I mean, on the sports side, there are kind of these like in baseball, fan graphs and baseball prospectus, other kind of data oriented outlets. Trying to think of more in politics. There are lots of people doing good data work in politics. I think the appeal of 538 is that it's like probably the one outlet that does it exclusively, whereas other places like the Post, like the Times, have kind of the one person devoted to data journalism. I'm sure I'm forgetting something, so I apologize to whoever it is who I'm forgetting.
Just a quick follow-on to that. Yeah. Do you think that then 538's appeal is to the person who's kind of interested in the data and wants an explanation of it, and then you're also getting people that are kind of enticed by the visualization, and then they go on to read and learn a little more on statistics and the data sets that you're relying on? How do you feel what's the prescription up there? Do you know what I'm saying? Like what you're selling, basically, and what audiences you're capturing. You know what I'm saying?
Not quite.
So basically, we know, who've been studying journalism, been doing it, who've been writing it, what we would say, know your publication like you knew what Micah and Nate were writing.
Right.
You knew how to write like them, you knew what data sets to rely on.
Right.
The readers are going to know, like Jeremy points out, I'm reading this because I know that I want to go to you to understand Warren and how she did in 2018. So are you then capturing some other folks that aren't necessarily knowing that that's the data place to go to?
Yeah, probably, and hopefully. I do think that in general, our readership is, to your question as well, is people who are already very informed about politics and are kind of ready to take kind of the next level. I think for most people, their intro to politics is what they watch on CNN and Fox and MSNBC. Cable news I think is still by far the most dominant medium. But I mean, I do hope that and our partnership with ABC News is great in this regard. I do hope that we're reaching a more mainstream audience as well. But yeah, I think we write for people who we assume that they have a kind of a baseline knowledge. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, everybody.
Hope this is